Okay, I'm going to start. Yeah, it's not a long session. It's just half an hour. So if anyone might want to join. Yeah, the idea is to present a guide, which has come out of some European research that Fab Barcelona at EAC is involved with other members. The idea is to present an overview of this. So I'll give a quick kind of overview of the research, what was done, what is included in this guide. And then I wanted to discuss this. Obviously, I think it's very interesting to discuss this in an international context, specifically because this is a European research. So I think it would be nice to then discuss it together and some of your feedback or thoughts on this guide and this project. So I'm going to share my screen. I just hope that it's going to work because I have it in PDF. I think I can do, if I do this, can you see?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, this project is, or the session is called Rethinking How Makers Exchange, and the project is called Makers Exchange. So how do I move this? Oh yeah. So this is an ongoing research. It's a pilot project on makers mobility co-funded by the European Union. The idea is to bring together organizations that have experience in and networks within Exchange and the maker community. So the members are the European Creative Hubs Network, who is the lead, and then Fab Barcelona, who I represent, UPTech in Porto in Portugal, and Makery from France, which is media for makers. And the idea is to look at makers as a very broad term. So this is something that is reflected in the research in that it's not necessarily looking specifically just at the maker movement, but also towards makers as a wider organization of people or movement of people who are using technology or traditional tools, methods to create and to make. So this is kind of reflected in the mapping that was done inside the project, you will see. You can see my full screen, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I have
Is it landscape?
Yeah, and now it's got a girl coding. Yeah, I think
what?
it's correct.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay.
Just in the PDF.
Yeah, you can see some text and a girl coding, correct?
Hey, Kate, this is Jean-Michel from the Fab Foundation.
Hey.
I'm sorry, I had to jump out to help other sessions. You're a host, so we can see your screen, at least I can, perfectly well.
Okay, perfect. I just have a funny message.
Sorry, go ahead, tell me.
No, it's okay, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that, you have to let people in, but I think you've been doing that, so that seems to be going well.
Yeah, I hope. I'm now in presenter mode, so I can't see anything else.
Okay, well, so just from time to time check, because people might be in the waiting room, or you could make somebody co-host and then that person keep an eye on it for you. I have to jump around between sessions to help people.
Okay.
So if there's any issue, you can use the Telegram group to contact me.
Okay, sweet. Thank you.
Have a good session.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, the project itself in Max, it is, I can do this. Helen. How do I do this? Okay, wait, back. Oh, hang on, now I've gone completely the other way. Sorry, everyone. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm just going to stop and move back. Apologies. Okay. So. Okay. So let me share my screen again. Okay, now we're back. So the aim of the project is to look at the idea of mobility and exchange within the maker community from a very wide angle. and to really understand how mobility and exchange experiences between culture and creative industries, creative hubs, makerspaces, fab labs, non-formal and formal learning are currently being developed. And in doing this, the idea is to look at which ways we could exist for embedding maker mobility schemes and for skills development and inclusion into some of the support programs that exist within the European Union. So this is specifically looking to introduce makers as a key actor in the exchange programs that currently exist at the European level. So this is the guide that I want to talk about. I've shared a link to it and you can access this. The guide is basically looking at existing mobility schemes. So it looks at the landscape of these mobility schemes and the importance of these in developing the movement of makers in Europe and the exchange between these makers, looking specifically at mobility as a key exchange mechanism. So understanding what metrics might be used for measuring the impact of exchange and mobility, and how this can kind of focus on not only the mobility of makers, but also the exchange of ideas within the community and skills practices as well. The idea is that the guide will be a useful tool. So you can use this, it can be used by makers and maker networks, but it's not at all an exhaustive list. And this is something that I would also like to discuss later. So brief overview of the mapping. The process was to look at more or less a literature review of everything that was going on at the moment. The idea was to look at the detail of the working methods and financing in each of the cases of the mobility schemes found in that literature review. The aim was to examine the involvement of existing European networks, which networks and who was involved and who was targeted by that by the specific mobility scheme or program. Looking at in exchange and mobility, what is the best length for this stay? So is it short, medium or long-term stay, or slow mobility, for example, as a good practice? And what kind of best practice was available in each of the schemes? So the guide itself actually reflects on that effort that was made to actually collect and to synthesize all of that data. It doesn't include every single maker scheme ever or mobility scheme ever, but what it does is it focuses on the role of makers within existing mobility schemes and mobility programs. To do this, it focused on kind of main points of research. So we took the mobility schemes and looked at all of the mobility schemes that were existing and exchange schemes that were existing in Europe that we could find, and address the following focuses, specifically looking at who was targeted, what sectors were targeted, what was the kind of method for that exchange, the objective of the scheme. So was it about impact? Was it about collaboration? For example, where the money was coming from, this was an important one. How much money was available to undertake the scheme, the duration of the stay, as I said before, and the geographical scope of the scheme and any good practices that came out of that scheme. So these are the kind of overall findings and a bit of an executive summary. And then after, I'm going to go through some of the points which I found really interesting before we have a quick discussion. So firstly, the makers activities and the makers exchange activities in mobility were very much non-specific in their form. So there was a lot of different kinds of ways of working, lots of different approaches to what was being produced inside these schemes. And basically the outcome of this is that it's really interesting in that, you know, makers do really cover a very wide range of skill sets, a wide range of forms, and it's very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all approach to mapping and also to understanding the needs of the maker community. So there was really also a need to raise awareness on maker mobility and connect makers with the broader culture and creative community. So the potential of makers to really be key in addressing social and environmental impact and different kinds of impacts in the way that we exchange and find mobility opportunities. This was very much, it very much showed inside the mapping. Both formal and informal maker communities play a significant role in providing and facilitating mobility opportunities. So this is something interesting when we look at communities like the Fab Network, or we look at those communities such as the Hacker and Hacker Network. There are non-formal and formal opportunities within that, and we all know about kind of Fab Nomads, these kinds of things, and I think that for this kind of mobility to be recognized at the European level, it's very important, and it gives a very nice reflection on the kind of innovation that is happening inside the maker community and the importance of exchange and mobility for our communities. Yes, the need to mix a combination of metrics to understand the impact of mobility schemes, this was very important. The mobility schemes that were assessed, not many actually used the word maker. And so this also became important and was really highlighted that maker as a specific term could be used to target mobility, to target makers inside mobility schemes. And finally, makers, although they are very much reflected in what is being asked for, they're not necessarily recognized inside the open calls for mobility and exchange. So we have a lot of these kind of informal opportunities, but at the European level, inside European mobility schemes and funding, there should be or could be more addressed specifically to makers themselves. So some quick findings, which I think are really interesting from the mobility schemes that were mapped. You can see that most of the funding that was received in the bottom that was mapped comes from European program. So this comes from projects that are funded directly from the European Commission in some way through some kind of funding scheme. Some of the next largest pocket is self-finance schemes. So for example, through application fees, or these kinds of programs. So I think that this is really interesting, that a lot of the money that we are seeing is public money, or indeed it's about self-financing or being paid for by the community. The other interesting thing that I think is really interesting about this, which comes out of the guide, is the difference between who is being targeted and who is being involved. So inside the makers field, we have obviously Fab Labs, maker spaces, cultural hubs, and they are also being involved in these schemes. So for the application, is it an individual application or is it an application for groups and collectives? Both of these are important, and this really shows the collaborative nature of the community and of the way that makers are working. And then in terms of audiences, we have mainly individuals being supported by the existing mobility schemes. So this is great if you have access to community or anybody who's interested to take some kind of maker or some kind of mobility program or exchange. There are opportunities out there for individuals, which is great because this is not necessarily the case in all fields. So here's just a very brief overview of some of the funds that were looked at and some of the mobility funding programs and schemes that were looked at. Again, these ones are not necessarily targeted to makers, but makers are definitely eligible to apply. So what happens obviously is that these are for the culture and creative industries, and makers become part of that, but are not necessarily targeted. Oh, I don't know if I can go back. I don't know if I can go back. Oh, there we go. Oh, there you go. So here we go. Also, we have another, which is a platform obviously we see the Fair Foundation here. We see other projects that have been developed by, our network. One thing that is interesting here is that we do have some really great examples of maker-specific platforms for mobility. So Volca is a really good one. This is a non-for-profit in the EU who are really working directly with makers and communities to develop making exchange and programs. And then Maker Tour, which is a French organization who is working with workshops, workshops and projects in makerspaces around the world. And then the others, they're really working more on how you can develop all sorts of different kinds of programming. iPortunus is one for cultural professionals where, of course, makers are represented, but they're not necessarily targeted. So this is really all from the guide that I wanted to share. Something to just kind of maybe, I would say, suggest or add to this is that the project also has an experimentation aspect. So not only are we mapping and understanding what kinds of maker programs are out there and what kinds of mobility and exchange programs are out there, but we're actually piloting a maker exchange with both online and offline participants. So this has been delivered by Fab Lab Barcelona, and we had previously 10 participants, and we're now running 15 physical and 5 digital exchanges. And so we're going to have some outputs from this, which I think is going to also be really interesting to understand, what are the kinds of, I guess, the frameworks that can be implemented to assist these kinds of exchanges and mobility. But what I wanted to ask you as a group is maybe if you have any reflections on the research, the idea of exchange right now, specifically given the fact that we're in the middle of COVID, and maybe some reflections on what exchange means to the maker community. I think something that's really interesting for me here is the non-European focus. We're all sitting in our homes, visiting Fab 16, which is awesome. But, what does this mean in terms of how we exchange and how we come together to learn from each other, develop skills and have impact. So I'm going to stop sharing. Maybe here you can find out more about the project and about what we're doing. I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe if anybody has any feedback or thoughts from their side of the discussion, anyone, maybe, I don't know, Barbara, you have an interesting perspective because you're working very much with international organizations, and maybe it would be interesting to hear if you have any thoughts on that in terms of exchange and mobility.
Hi, so I'm Barbara with the Internet of Production Alliance. I think the reason why I wanted to hear about this is because we want to look at how you map skills in general, so that eventually we would be able to think, okay, I want to make this there, but is there anyone who can do this? And so what's I guess is interesting if we look further into the future is that if you're able to do an exchange program in the same way that you can do it with like technical university diplomas, you're paving the way for international professional mobility of makers. And if Europe can sort of lead the way, we're working, a lot of us are working more in disaster prone areas or in very remote areas, and even from like a public policy standpoint, like seeing what we can do in a city versus what we can do in a rural area, if we're able to codify those exchange programs from hyper urban to micro manufacturing rural, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, the comment, the urban versus rural, I think is super interesting, and I think it's going to become so much more relevant, and it's something that isn't covered by this specific mapping, but I think it would be very interesting because it does have a lot of impact on, connectivity, kind of the ability to really participate, and what that impact then looks like back into the context that you're actually exchanging in. So, and I think the comment you made was about professional exchange, which I think is also really interesting, and I'm going to take a note about this. Awesome. Very nice. Does anybody else have any comments or questions about the guide? I left it in the chat, and it's also in the group if anybody's interested to check it out. Yeah, maybe
a comment about that. The recordings of the sessions, they go on YouTube. And I was just checking out some of them from last year. You don't have the chat in it. So
okay, yeah.
I don't know if you want to say out loud a way to then find this document for people watching this on YouTube in the future.
Okay, so you can find it on the website. So Makers Exchange with no E, so just the X, exchange.eu. And then you can find it through there. It's on the resources page. And also it's inside the live.fablabs.io if anybody's interested. Yeah, it's there, but that's a good point actually, because I think you might be coming to this at a different time, which is also interesting in terms of exchange and mobility. I don't know if anybody has any examples from their network or their community around exchange and mobility. I don't know if anybody is working in this space. Anybody wants to comment around it?
Kate, I was just going to say that kind of Scotland-wise, there's been like a few developments recently where obviously mobility has been the challenge, but the digital has kind of kicked in. So right at the beginning of the lockdown, we were running an exchange with Canada practitioners, makers, craftspeople. So they all kind of self-defined what they wanted that digital, what's the word? Pivot to be. We then have also been looking at VR spaces for practitioners to come together. At the moment, we're just looking in Scotland, but part of the reason for doing that was to look at how we could exchange across distance, but using a VR space. And we're in the second phase of R&D for that one and seeing what that does. And that was very much a data-driven project to begin with. So we were looking at the data that exists in our offline spaces and how that transfers into the online spaces and kind of back out again and kind of across distance. And we've had some really interesting practitioners kind of going into that space. And then the other one I was just going to mention, which I'm not involved in, is that they're actually primarily a theatre company, but they have been running various programs and have pivoted online, but they do quite targeted programs now that look at kind of more established practitioners. So it has a more kind of holistic view around practice and pivot in practice or pivot in targeting or, kind of ambition or aims to support that. And then also what the digital has allowed as or kind of is permitting more of in terms of the online is supporting people who have other needs in their life, whether that's caring, could be about access or disability. So there's definitely been a push here in Scotland about being able to, kind of articulating what that looks like to someone who does need to participate in a different way, because mobility isn't, if we take the word mobility, not saying that's all the research is about, but that's been really great to have people be able to see how they see themselves in a program because of, the barriers that are created for them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to the idea of what we were saying before about the rural, about different contexts. It's everything from agency to accessibility to actually how we think previously or have thought about mobility. You know, it's always been, okay, well, we have to travel, we have to be there, we have to do the thing. But I think one thing that's come recently is that this is just not the case anymore, and we can really exchange in very successful ways. And obviously with the FabLab network, that's always been the idea, is having this distance connectivity. Awesome. Well, that's actually, I mean, the end of the discussion session. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add, but I encourage you to take a look at the guide for mobility, and I'm available if you have any questions or if you'd like to contribute anything else to the discussion. Yeah, I guess this is, yeah, that's all. And thank you very much for joining, and thank you for your inputs, and enjoy your Fab 16. There's so many things to see and do. So, you know, we're going to be exchanging and being mobile from our bedrooms or our kitchens for a whole week. So thank you very much for joining, and I guess I hope I see most of you at other events.
Thanks, Kate.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.